The great and the good of global business and politics arrive in Davos for their annual get-together. It comes after millions of people in almost every corner of the world protested against economic inequality. So will the elites in Switzerland do anything to close what many say is a widening gap between rich and poor? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Our economic system is broken. The rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. That's the message from Oxfam in a report released as business and political leaders gather in Switzerland for the 50th World Economic Forum. The charity found the number of billionaires has doubled over the past decade to more than 2,000. They control more money than the 4.5 billion or so poorest people on Earth. And here's another way of looking at it. If the two richest men sat on their fortunes piled up in $100 bills, they would be in outer space, while most people, particularly women, would be sitting on the floor. Now, Oxfam says the gap is widening because governments are failing to ensure wealthy people and corporations pay enough tax. Well, inequality was at the heart of many of the protests around the world last year. Plans to raise public transport fares in Chile, for instance, triggered large demonstrations against the government's economic policies, which many people said merely favour the rich. And rising fuel and living costs sparked the yellow vest movement in France. There were violent protests in Iran when the government raised petrol prices by up to 3 times overnight. Rights groups estimate at least 300 people died. And when Sudan's government cut fuel and bread subsidies, protests led to revolution, and President Omar al-Bashir was swept away after 30 years in office. All right, let's introduce our panel now. In London, we have Daragh McDowell. He's the head of Europe and principal Russia analyst at the global risk consultancy Verisk Maplecroft. In Nairobi, Kenya, Max Lawson, head of policy on inequality at Oxfam International. Also in London, we have Matthew Lesh, head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. Now, welcome to you all. I'd like to start off, though, with a quote that comes from that Oxfam report. And it says, governments around the world can and must build a human economy that is feminist and benefits the 99%, not only the 1%. So let's go to Max now in Nairobi. Of course, you're the author of this report. And what do you mean by a human economy? And what do you mean by a feminist economy?
I think at the moment we have a broken economy. We have an economy that's clearly working for a very small group of people, these billionaires right at the top, and the majority of them are men. And then at the bottom, you've got hundreds of millions of people living on less than $5 a day, working for very little money. Again, the majority of them women. So it's a sexist economy, it's an unequal economy. So a more human economy, a more feminist economy, if you like, would seek to close that gap between rich and poor and would seek to spread out the wealth more evenly, more fairly. And we think that would be much better for humanity and much better for the economy too.
And Max, surely we could have had this conversation a year ago. Tell me what's changed between January 2019, in the run-up to Davos on the 49th year, and this year?
Sadly, very little has changed at the top. We're still seeing a huge increase in the wealth of billionaires. We've seen the number of billionaires double. We're living through a billionaire boom. But what has changed in the last year is the level of protest, the level of anger, the numbers of people on the street. People are absolutely fed up with an economy that clearly only delivers for those at the very top and is failing to deliver even basic foodstuffs for ordinary people. So I think that's a big change. We're seeing anger across the world, and elites cannot ignore this forever.
Right, coming to Matthew now. Matthew, you have written that the report, the Oxfam report, authored by Max, is complete hogwash.
Look, quite frankly, it is. And I think it's quite shameful that Oxfam is releasing this same disingenuous report year after year after year. What Oxfam has done by focusing on what it calls net wealth, it actually means that the bottom decile has over $1.5 trillion in negative wealth. That includes recent Oxford graduates or Harvard graduates who have a large amount of debt. It actually tells us very little about how the worst off in society are going. What we know is that over the last 10 years, the amount of people in extreme poverty has actually halved. That means 158,000 people a day have been lifted out of poverty. Meanwhile, global income inequality is actually declining, and it's declining precisely because we have rising living standards in China, in India, and even particularly in recent years across Africa.
All right.
So even if you look at other measures of inequality like height or healthcare, things are actually getting much better and not worse.
Let's go back to Max then. So, Max, it seems very much, if you listen to Matthew, that you're actually measuring the wrong thing.
Yes, and he's completely wrong, and he's said it many years before. If you don't want to listen to Oxfam, you can listen to the World Bank, to the International Monetary Fund, to the OECD. All of them are pointing to growing inequality in many countries as a serious, serious problem. And the rate of poverty reduction, which he highlighted, as we say in our report this year, has halved. And in fact, extreme poverty in Africa is going back up. And institutions like the World Bank have said very clearly that one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest issues that means that we cannot reduce poverty further is this huge gap between rich and poor. We do need to tackle inequality if we want a world free of poverty, and we certainly can't ignore the world's billionaires and the boom in billionaire wealth, which is really hard to ignore.
Right. And Daragh, 2019 has been called by many people the year of protest. It was remarkable, wasn't it? Because of the spread of protest. We had it in Latin America, we had it in Africa, we had it in Europe as well.
Absolutely. We observed last year 47 countries, that's almost a quarter of the world, where there was a significant uprise in political unrest, civil unrest, and protest activity. And digging into this, the main drivers of this activity, what we've seen is rising inflation, the withdrawal of public subsidies for fuel and food, or increases in the cost of those basic staples, and the lack of mechanisms for channeling political discontent within a larger political system, i.e. authoritarianism or simply imperfect democracies. So what we are seeing across the globe, from places like France, where a relatively small uptick in fuel duty prompted the Gilets jaunes protests, the same in Chile, where a seemingly small increase, I believe, in public transportation costs are causing large-scale protests. And this is happening in Russia with the pension protests, and across Africa as well, in places like Zimbabwe, South Africa. And it is driven by a sense of economic and political inequality. Essentially, you're seeing growing groups of citizens who don't feel that they're stakeholders in their own societies because of these things. Life is getting harder, and they don't feel that they have channels to make their grievances heard, so they're going out into the streets. And this is a trend that we forecast is going to accelerate in 2020.
All right, let's talk about 2020 in a little while. Let's go back to you, Matthew, then. So what's taking so many thousands of people out on the streets in so many different countries, many people even risking their lives against a heavy-handed security force response? Why do you think so many people in 2019 are prepared to put their life on the line to demonstrate against what they call social or economic inequality?
Well, I think in many ways what we're seeing across the world is political movements against the perception that the governments and politicians in particular are increasingly elite and disconnected from the interests and concerns of the people that they represent. I think we've got a governmental and a political crisis going on in the world today. If you actually look just in the last few days, Elderman has released their annual trust barometer, and it finds that the extreme lack of trust in both the competency as well as the ethics of government are quite extraordinary at this point in time, particularly in Western countries, and there's an underlying pessimism about the state of the global economy and where we're going as a society. I think in many ways that's increased by narratives that create false claims about the state of the world rather than actually enabling people to prosper and flourish with free markets and free trade.
And Max, in Nairobi, your annual report, comes out specifically to grab the headlines at a time when the world's political and business elite are gathering in Davos. Have you ever seen anything of much consequence come from this get-together in the Swiss Alps?
No, I think, as someone said last year at Davos, it's about a bit like asking arsonists how to put out a fire. I mean, these are the big winners of the global economy. As far as they're concerned, things are going absolutely fine. So it's very hard to expect them to come out with anything like the radical solutions that we need. For instance, much higher taxation of wealth or much better regulation of corporations. But I would say that the solutions are out there. Inequality is not inevitable. And you can see from the protests, you can see that people, I would agree, are fed up with elites, and they're fed up with politicians who've been captured by elites. I mean, we have a billionaire president in the White House who's just given a huge tax cut to the top 1% in America. Across the world, people can see that their politicians are listening to the super rich and not listening to them. And I think when that starts to change and politicians see they have to listen to ordinary people, that's when we'll see inequality reducing.
All right.
I don't see the elites at Davos doing anything positive in that direction.
All right, now I'd like to ask you all, and I'll stay with you, Max, first. I'd like to ask you all about what your thoughts are about the inclusion now of a calculation to include carbon neutral planning. This is now going to be taken on board by the global economy to various degrees. How do you think, Max, that is going to affect the global economy? Is this likely to be a catalyst for change?
I think the plans that are out there, things like the Green New Deal in the US, are extremely exciting. I mean, here in Kenya, where I live, you see the very visceral impact of climate change every day. You've got droughts, floods, we've even got a plague of locusts this week. People are dying because of climate change, so we really need to radically reform our global economy to do that. But we must do that in a way that respects social justice, that closes the gap between rich and poor. As we saw in France, if we try and implement environmental taxes that hit ordinary people without the elites being seen to do anything towards climate change, then you will just get an equal and opposite reaction. We need to tackle economic inequality and the climate crisis together.
Right. Matthew, coming to you, this commitment under the Paris Accord of 2015 by and large commits or pledges the major global economies, of course the US is not part of it now, to a carbon neutral economy by the year 2050. How would you see that filtering into the current calculations now that are likely to be talked about in Davos?
Look, it's clearly quite a difficult goal that the world has set. It is clearly necessary to decarbonise our economies. And I think, quite frankly, the only way to achieve that is really to embrace the market and embrace innovation and opportunities presented. We've already seen in recent history a decline in the carbon intensity of our economies. So we're managing to produce more economic output using fewer carbon emissions. That's because of newer technologies. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to have to really rely on if we're going to be able to address the challenge presented by climate change.
Matthew, what are the kinds of things, what are the kinds of changes in the global economy that are currently in place and that we can perhaps expect for the rest of this year? Because obviously any change in global systems will have an impact. And I'm just wondering what we can expect.
Well, I think it's obviously hard to predict the future in terms of what I can expect. I think that when it comes to policymakers, a lot of the focus needs to be on trying to remove the barriers to innovative new technologies, remove barriers to new nuclear energy plants that produce low carbon energy, to GM genetically modified food that can produce more food using less agricultural space and therefore produce fewer carbon emissions. And that's the kind of approach the policymakers should take in the years ahead if we're going to actually tackle climate change rather than just talk about tackling climate change.
Right. And Max, do you think that this rebooting of the global economy towards a carbon neutral future, do you think that this offers an opportunity for more equality, for more equity within global financial and economic systems?
I think there's a huge opportunity to repurpose our economies, to tackle climate change and tackle inequality at the same time. I disagree with Matthew that the way to do that is through more deregulation, through more free markets, through more of a kind of casino capitalism that has led us to the kind of grotesque levels of inequality that we have at the moment. It's going to take careful planning, careful investment to create the millions of new green jobs, to really repurpose our entire economies. That's a huge job and it desperately needs doing. But I think it can be done and done in a way that's very positive. It's great for women, it's great for the poorest, and it's great for the planet.
Right, and Daragh, are we witnessing in many ways the after effects, if you like, the hangover from the financial crash of 2008 still? It's the people on the ground, those who've been protesting as well as others, who've had to endure austerity. And as Matthew alluded to, there's also a profound loss of trust, both in the economic systems that govern our world and indeed leadership, political leadership.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the changes in the political landscape in Europe since 2006, 2007, we've seen a rise in populist parties, not just of the far right, but also of the far left. And we went from this post-Cold War period where we had 20 years of a fairly widely accepted, neoliberal economic doctrine, or whatever you'd like to call it, the Washington Consensus, that did deliver rising living standards to a lot of people. And then there was this crunch period, which left an aftertaste in which a lot of people seem to think, well, we got poorer, whereas the people who caused the crisis got richer and kept their positions. Now, you can argue whether or not that narrative is factually correct or the nuance within that, but that is the greater perception of people across not only just authoritarian states where we frequently see people rising up against governments and protesting due to a lack of other options, but equally in the established democracies, where there is a sense that the political and financial structures of society are no longer working for the vast majority of people within them. Again, this isn't just a question of economic growth or how what kind of jobs people have. It is a question of to what extent citizens feel like stakeholders in their societies, and increasingly they feel less and less attached to them, or they feel less and less represented by the people who are running their countries, and hence they're coming out in the streets and they're becoming more critical of the system as a whole, not just particular policies.
Right, and coming to you, Matthew, also in London, I'd like to raise the words that were uttered by Rutger Bregman, a Dutch economist, or Dutch historian, forgive me, last year at Davos, who basically slammed all the delegates, I'm led to understand, and he said that the basic formula for restructuring and making a more equitable financial system, economic system, is taxation. Would you agree? Max has already mentioned the issue of taxation for the big corporations and for the mega rich.
I think in many ways Davos does represent what people find so frustrating about capitalism, which are these very cosy relationships between big business and big government, and the seeking of special support and special bailouts in their times of need while the rest of society loses out. I do question whether or not, though, taxation is really the key issue here. We already have an extremely progressive taxation system. The top 1% of taxpayers in the UK pay about 29% of all income tax. In the US, it's even higher. The top 1% of income earners pay about 40% of all income tax. I'm not sure that it's possible to make our taxation systems more progressive and to really try to take wealth from the rich much more without it really hurting your overall levels of growth and your overall levels of prosperity. And I think that makes people much worse off. I think we spend enough time talking about how terrible the rich are and how awful they are, despite the fact that it's, of course, the rich that have innovated and provided services that we all benefit from. I think we actually need to spend time thinking about how we can raise people up. It's not us versus them. The rich don't get richer by making the poor poorer. That's just a myth. We can all get richer together, and that's quite frankly the nature of a successful economy. We don't need to hate the rich to reduce poverty. In fact, people have gotten richer while we've reduced poverty at the same time over the last 30 years when we've raised 1 billion people out of extreme poverty.
All right. And Matthew, I'll take your words, the words that you wrote, and put them to Max, because Matthew accuses Oxfam of not exactly loving the poor, but hating the rich. Is that the fact?
I think it's very clear that we're living through a billionaire boom, that we have too much extreme wealth in too few hands, and that we do need to. And we're in a situation at the moment where, and Warren Buffett, the third richest man on earth, he says this regularly, he has a lower rate of tax than his secretary. We're in an upside-down world where, because of tax havens, because of tax cuts, like the tax cuts given by Donald Trump to rich people in America, where rich people are paying lower rates of tax than working class Americans. That's not fair, that's not right, that's not about hating rich people, that's about a fair system where everyone shoulders the burden. And we think that, well, not just us, I mean the IMF, the World Bank, many respected authorities think there's considerable scope for increasing taxation on the richest. And just, it's important to imagine what that means. That means schools, that means hospitals, it means teachers, it means doctors. It's incredibly important to take that revenue out of the secret bank accounts in Switzerland and start spending it on schools instead.
Right. And Daragh, how would you characterise, therefore, the challenge that lies in front of all of those mingling together in Davos right now? What is the essence of the global economic challenge that we're looking to them to provide certainly some of the answers to?
Well, a lot of it is a question of coordination and also cooperation between governments. Matthew is very correct to point out that, and you know, this has become much more public knowledge since the financial crisis, the increasing offshoreization of wealth, and also the rise of multinational corporations, which can effectively reduce their tax burden through various means. You know, we saw in the U.S. Amazon recently competing for municipal benefits with regards to the city it was choosing for its new headquarters. There is a degree to which private enterprise and corporations have become less amenable to political control through taxation, through regulation, and all of those sorts of things. And that's simply because different countries have different jurisdictions, they have different legislation and regulations, and they will compete with each other on that basis. That's a lot of what we're seeing with, you know, post-Brexit UK. So whether or not we can have some sort of mutually beneficial cooperation rather than beggar-thy-neighbor policies with regards to regulation, that goes from taxation to environmental laws, is really something that we're going to have to wait and see at this Davos.
I have to jump in, Daragh.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to jump in there because we are running out of time. Now, I want quickly to go back to Matthew and ask you for a very brief response, if possible. And that is, so you believe then that a free market, free trade environment is going to satisfy the people, for instance, in Sudan, those people who went out, they protested and they managed to sweep away an authoritarian regime because their pockets primarily were hurting. Do you think that they will accept a free market, unregulated markets?
Well, I don't think the free market is necessarily unregulated. I think what we've seen over recent decades is that prosperity is very much linked to freer markets and freer trade. Already in Africa, we've seen the development of the African Trading Union bloc through the African Union, and that's going to provide extraordinary economic benefits to people across Africa. I do think at the same time, of course, political freedom and will come in many ways potentially along with that, and there will be demands, particularly as there are rising middle classes, for the ability to have a say in the way that societies are governed and to ensure that resources aren't stolen from government for the few and not the many. But I think ultimately we can't give up what's proven to be the single most successful poverty alleviation tool known to humankind, which are free markets and free trade.
All right, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Daragh McDowell in London, Max Lawson in Nairobi, and Matthew Lesh also in London. Thank you all very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's always Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.